Today I will be attempting to revive this Lionel 462.
I'll quickly demonstrate exactly what the main problem with this unit is. I'll give it a little bit of power, but as you can see, the headlight's on and it's not moving. And now, if I give this thing just a little bit more of a push, it does actually start moving if I give it a little bit of help. What I've found is I am pretty sure this motor is either weak or the magnet is weak. I am hoping it's the magnet because I don't really have a way to replace this motor, but I'm going to try and fix this thing and see if I can resolve this weak magnet problem.
So, as you saw, the motor did not want to move, and I am pretty sure I know the problem. I have off-camera messed around with this thing a little bit and have found a few things out. Nothing crazy, but I'm pretty sure that motor magnet is just about gone. I'm going to attempt to replace it with neodymium magnets. I'm not sure how well it'll work, and I hope it's not the motor windings or anything like that, which is bad because I don't really have anything to replace it with. And if I can't replace it and it's a bad motor, this project will just be junk, which I do not want to have happen. I did originally have some problems disassembling this thing, but I have found a much easier way to take off the shell, which I don't know how I didn't notice earlier. And while I was messing with this thing right before this video, I found that I can actually just, untwist this, and then you just spread the cab apart a little bit, and the shell comes right off. I was doing some other weird convoluted thing to take this apart, I don't know why, but this is how you're actually supposed to take it apart, not the ridiculous way I tried to earlier. Now that everything else is out of the way, another thing that's really weird about this engine are the screws. Well, they're all flathead, which is nice. I think almost every single screw on this locomotive is a different size. You have this large one that holds in the weight here. You have these smaller ones, which I believe hold on this motor. You have, on the underside, this one, and you have the screws on the back of the motor. It's just all weird. And then you have this screw on the front, and you have this one random Phillips screw on the front as well, which is just ridiculous, and I don't understand why it's here. So I'm going to see if I can remember how to take this thing apart, and I'm just going to attempt to remove this weight and get access to the wheels themselves and remove the motor. Now that I have this locomotive apart, I'm going to focus on this motor first because this is quite obviously our problem. Usually with these motors, what I've noticed is that when you spin these over, there'll be a little bit more resistance in them, at least for this style. There's other styles of motors that don't, but for your basic motor that's in most old HO scale locomotives, it's also pretty easy to feel the magnet working and moving the pole. It'll feel a little bit clunky, but that's a good indicator that the magnet is in good shape, at least from my experience. And this one, I can spin freely, which this thing should not be doing, and that's a pretty clear sign, to me at least, that this magnet is in bad shape. So, I'm going to absolutely need to disassemble this motor as little as possible, and attempt to put in some new neodymium magnets, which I hope will resolve the issue. Something else noteworthy are the wheels themselves. What's a little bit unusual is that these actually pop out into the locomotive, unlike most other locomotives that I've worked on where the wheels are held in by a plate and fall out the bottom. It's an odd design, but it works pretty well. However, there is a problem with these wheels. This one, which has the traction tire, is pretty heavily rusted. So if I get that motor functional, I'm going to need to spend a lot of time cleaning up this wheel, and I'll need to replace the traction tire. Luckily, since this is an older steam engine, and it's not anything crazy, Lionel did this design really well. They actually used a screw instead of a nut for the drive rods, which is really nice because all I need to do is unscrew this, and then I can easily remove that traction tire and replace it with a new one once I clean up this wheel. So that should make my life significantly easier than it would be otherwise. In terms of our other drive components, this worm gear and other gear assembly looks completely fine. It's got a little bit of dirt and stuff on there, but that's not going to be too hard to clean up. I've moved everything else to the side, and what I'm going to attempt to do is remove the screws back here, which should, in theory, remove this plate, meaning I can have better access to the magnet. Perfect, and just like that, I can slide the magnet slide the magnet out of there. I've been messing with this motor for a little bit of time, and there is both good news and bad news. The good news is I have identified the problem. It was this magnet. I tested the motor out with my own neodymium magnets, and it works almost flawlessly. It does have a little bit of motor bearing noise, but that just needs some fresh oil, which we'll solve in a little bit. The bad news, however, is that my magnets are too big for this motor to actually fit in the locomotive. I could, in theory, fit it in there, but I would have to cut some pretty ugly holes in the shell of this thing, which I don't really want to do. So I've gone online and I've ordered some new ones. I've been wanting to do this for a while anyway, and this is definitely the correct excuse for me to go out and buy a few more different sizes of magnets so that it'll actually work. I also did a little bit of modification to this. The magnets themselves wanted to stick to the armature because there wasn't really a good way to separate them. So resting on top of the screws that hold this motor together, I've just got a little piece of plastic that I put in there, which stopped the magnets from interfering with the armature while it's trying to rotate, which is good. The other thing I did, which I've just now noticed, is I managed to break off the wire, so when I put this thing back together, I'm going to have to rewire it. However, my plan for this locomotive right now is while I have everything apart, I'm going to clean out this piece here, the wheels themselves, deal with the traction tire, and everything I can while I've got it apart. So that when these new magnets come in, all I have to do is remove the shell, plop them in, and hopefully this thing will run. So my goal is going to be starting with this base, then I'm going to move on to this little part right over here, the shaft, and then I'm going to deal with these axles themselves. Then I'll spend quite a bit of time finding this wheel. I don't know if I'll get all the rust off, but I'll try my best with some rubbing alcohol. I tried a little test spot and it seemed to work, but that'll be quite the project. So let me get some tools out and let me get to work cleaning all the components of this. Alright, all those components are cleaned off. Aside from this wheel, I'm going to go off camera again like I did for the motor and just clean that off because that rust is going to take a while to remove. Hopefully I can get it all off. If not, this wheel doesn't really pick up power anyway. It just will kind of look ugly like this, but it'll still function perfectly fine. So I'll work on this, hopefully replace that traction tire, and be back shortly.
This wheel has been cleaned up now to the best of my ability. It's still pretty rusty, but it's about as good as I could get it, and it's got a new traction tire. If anyone actually has any ideas why only this one wheel with the traction tire would get covered in rust and everything else would be completely clean, please let me know, because I'm a little bit clueless on this. Could it have something to do with the moisture in the old traction tire or something? The old one was completely dry rotted, so maybe that has something to do with it, but really, I have no clue. This locomotive has probably been in California its whole life, and in California, there's not a whole bunch of stuff with rust on it unless you're really close to the ocean, which I'm not insanely close to the ocean. So I don't really understand how here it would have gotten this rusty, but it has. So now it's time to put everything back together, now that I've got a traction tire on there. And I've noticed something a little bit annoying about this. This Lionel engine has bearings similar to an Athearn Blue Box, which is not the worst thing in the world, but for putting this thing back together, it's going to be a little bit annoying. So I don't need to put any oil in these bearings right here. I'm going to need to put fresh oil in there when I get this thing back in place. So it's time to start reassembling the rest of this locomotive, and then I'll just set it to the side and wait for the new magnets to get here. And once those are here, we will get this thing out and try and get this thing actually functional again. Apparently, I can't figure out where these screws go, so I'm going to return when I figure out which screw goes where, because I know this goes to the motor, I know one screw has to go here, but I don't know what it is. Lionel's design on this thing was a little bit ridiculous, and I've got to figure out what the solution to that is. So, I figured out the solution. I just grabbed another screw from my bin. Lionel's method for deciding screws on this thing is baffling me, so I just picked one that looked like it'll work. Doesn't have any rhyme or reason to it, but it fits the thread pattern that's already there, and I don't really care that much because Lionel's screws for this thing, again, are ridiculous. So now, I've got to strip this wire, tin it, and then I can resolder it back to the motor. Then all we've got to do is install the weight, this wheel, then I can throw the shell back on, and this thing can sit in storage for a while. I don't know how right that is, I can mess with it later if that's an issue, but now all I really gotta do is throw the shell back on. Then I'll let this thing sit aside for a while, then I'll come back once I've got some new magnets in.
These magnets arrived about 15 minutes ago, and I've already been messing with them in this engine. So, I've got a whole bunch of different sizes here. There's some that are microscopic, and then you have these massive ones here. And for this locomotive, I figured out that the best way to get as much magnetic force in here as possible was to use 3 different sizes. I've got these relatively normal sized ones here, which need to be short so they don't interfere with the top of the shell. These two here, which can be a little bit taller because it's in the middle of the cab, which has more clearance. And then I've got these little guys just because they fit directly behind these other magnets, and I don't think adding extra magnets to this thing will hurt. So all I really have left to do is to put this shell back on, and go test this thing out. And I'm hoping my magnet arrangement will work out. It's time to see if all that work has paid off. And it seems like it has. It's a little bit loud, but that's kind of what I'm expecting for an old steam locomotive. Well, that seems rather good, so why don't I put some cars behind this thing and run it with an actual train?